This week on Let Them Eat Bread, we are making what I think is a little too good to be true whole wheat loaf from jennycancook.com. So this whole recipe is only supposed to take an hour and a half if you don't count the mise en place time, and if you don't count the amount of time it spends to get the oven to get to the temperature you want it to do. In theory, you do that all now, but because I'm filming, my oven's not on yet. So I will be coming from a cold oven, but if you are starting your bread right now, your hour and a half bread and theoretically hour and a half timer, start your oven right now. You'll need it 375 Fahrenheit. So this bread is interesting for a number of reasons. One, as you saw on the shopping list this week, there are a number of things you can do with it to kind of change things up a little. But also, it'll be interesting to see because it's treating instant and active yeast the same. So as I mentioned, I'm using instant yeast this week. I'm using olive oil, I'm using honey, and I am using almond milk for my liquids this week. It'll be kind of interesting to see how this plays out, to see if it plays out as the instructor says it should. You know, we're going to trust the process. We'll see how it turns out. I would love to have a quick and easy honey wheat loaf recipe that I can do in 90 minutes, but something tells me it's not going to be that easy. Also, keep in mind, for the 90 minutes, the cook here, I guess her name is Jenny, is using a standing mixer. So because I'm doing everything by hand, I am not going to have the benefit of doing it that way. So I will be kneading by hand, which means that will probably take a little longer. But if you have a standing mixer, you should do that. And oh, one more quick thing, because this bread has an incredibly quick rise, it rises 2 times, and for a grand total of 45 minutes, 10 minutes in the middle, and then 35 minutes at the end. We're going to sneak our non-segment segment into the middle. Don't worry, when it's all cut up into videos, you won't even notice that that's the case, but we're going to stick it into there. I have some interesting thoughts from Yom HaShoah this week that I want to share with you if you watch the whole episode. And then we're going to stick our regular politics segment during that 35-minute rise. And, you know, we'll cover a couple of stories there. It's not going to be a super long episode this week. I am starting very late in the day, unfortunately. So we'll just see what happens. But all right, get your ingredients and let's get down to it.
All right, so we're going to take 2 cups of whole wheat flour and put that in a bowl, followed by half a cup of bread flour. Keep the bread flour round. You're going to need a lot more of it. Next up, a tablespoon of salt. You can add a little bit more, put a little bit less if you want. It's not going to affect it that much. Next up is going to be our yeast. We have 2 teaspoons of instant yeast, although you can use active dry. And we're just going to give this a quick stirry stir before we move on. Next up is our cup of almond milk. We are heating this to 130 degrees approximately for our instant yeast and giving that a bit of a stir. Next up, our honey, 2 tablespoons of the honey here. If you're adding the honey, you have to put it in now with the milk. If you're using sugar, you should do it when you put in the rest of the dry ingredients. All right, so we've stirred that. Next goes in our olive oil. We have 2 tablespoons of this, and then 1 egg. And I'm not going to lie, I thought that was going to explode all over my face, so I ducked. Or closed my eyes, when the egg dropped in. Next up, we're going to mix this around until it's nice and battery, and we're going to pour it out onto our table, but not before we flour our work surface. You actually want to go with a very heavy flouring for this. This is essentially a batter that you're putting on here. So if you pour too much flour out like I did, don't worry about it because you're going to use all of it and then some. So once you have gotten your kind of batter on the table here, the job is to make it into a dough. So I am flouring the top of my dough here to just try and make it easier so it doesn't stick it much. If you use a standing mixer to make this, you want to see that I'm doing slow turns, right? So push, turn, push, turn. It says to do 50 of those if you're coming out of a standing mixer. Of course, I'm doing everything by hand, so I'm just going to knead as usual. It will take a lot of flour, but eventually you will get to a state where you have a kneadable loaf of bread. The window pane test is not going to be a great test for this. It seems that for whole wheat breads that just doesn't work. I would use the poke test instead. So what that is you get it in, you put your bread into a ball like we always do, and then you put your finger into it, push down onto it, and the bread should spring back about 3/4 of the way, and that's how you know it's ready to rise. And we are about to be just finished.
All right, so our bread has been kneaded. You saw that I had to add a lot of flour to this recipe. So just be aware of that. If you're kneading by hand, you might need to add a lot of flour to get it to that tacky but not sticky consistency. All right, so this is going to rest for 10 minutes. And meanwhile, we're going to do our special segment and we'll continue with our regular segments later. So if you don't want to hang around for this, I'll see you in 10 minutes. Either way, we will be back doing bread in 10 minutes. So be back in 10 minutes. So this week was Yom HaShoah, which is the Jewish commemoration of the Holocaust. It's called Yom HaShoah. And one of the things that is kind of interesting about commemorating Yom HaShoah in today's world is that anti-Semitism around the world is on the rise. And it's not just kind of, people out there in Nazi uniforms chanting Nazi slogans and other things like that. But you can actually see people doing that. But that's not actually the anti-Semitism that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about kind of the modern context for how Hitler was able to get people to do the things to Jews that they ultimately ended up doing. Because as many scholars of history will tell you, the Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers, right? And this trope about the Holocaust, not trope, I mean, but this phrase about the Holocaust didn't begin with gas chambers, is really important because we have to take a look way back into Germany's past to kind of see how people got to where they were, right? So Jews have been vilified over the centuries for a number of reasons. The one that people kind of most commonly associate with Jews is the money stereotype, right? That's kind of the most common stereotype that's out there. Well, ever wonder where that came from? So the reason I ask is because not many people know where that particular stereotype came from, but the stereotype came from the fact that in the Middle Ages, the papacy needed people to serve as bureaucrats, tax collectors, accountants, and things of that nature. However, they could not do it themselves, and they couldn't hire people to do it because the Bible bans usury, which is high interest rates, right? And actually, the Bible technically bans interest rates, period, and offers debt forgiveness after 7 years. Well, the papacy did not want to be seen going against the good book, so their solution was to hire, by force, Jewish individuals to do these jobs. So it became the case that Jewish individuals throughout Catholic Europe, and by the way, I say Catholic Europe, I mean Christian Europe, doesn't really matter, there was no distinction at the time. And they hired them and forced them to do this work for them. And so over time, all the things that people don't really like anyway, taxes, money changers, bankers, and things like that, well, they then had to be Jews. So it became very easy then when interest rates were high, economies were bad, and the papacy and other Catholic religious / political leaders needed a scapegoat for why things were so bad. Well, you want to blame people who are doing well in a downturn. And of course, the people who control all the money or who control good portions of the money or have been forced to control portions of the money, collect taxes, what have you, are typically doing well, right? That's just kind of the world that we have lived in for a very long time. So it became very convenient for these political leaders to scapegoat the Jews because it wasn't just, hey, the bankers are screwing you and the tax collectors are screwing you and the accountants are screwing you. It's, hey, there's actually one group of people who does all of these things. It's the Jews. Now, of course, the Catholic Church did not tell its followers that it had forced the Jews to do this, and perhaps it had been long enough in historical past that they hadn't remembered, but this is where this comes from, right? And it has been persistent to the modern day, although it is not the case that Jews are forced to do these professions. Oftentimes, Jewish last names are reflective of some of these obligations that we have had over history. Goldstein, Silverstein, names having to do with money, last names having to do with money, oftentimes were given to Jews or Jews took them on. Remember, last names were originally about one profession. That's why you have a shit ton of John Smiths everywhere, because there were a lot of blacksmiths, right? I'm not really sure why they were all named John. You can't, I don't know that much. But the reason Smith is such a popular last name is because blacksmiths were a common profession. So when it used to be the case that last names were indicative of your profession, lots of Jews ended up with names that were similar to or exactly having to do with money, silversmith, things like that. So, of course, over the course of history, there has been this since that time, and we're talking like earlier than the Crusades here. Like we're talking a long, long time ago. Really, when the papacy was in its infancy, we're probably looking in like the 600s or 700s. Although I don't have an exact date for you, I apologize. But so essentially, you start with the point of me bringing this up is because you start with little things. Right? Oh, you don't like your taxes are too high, which outside of the world of anti-Semitism is a perfectly rational thing, right? I'm a taxpayer. I personally think my taxes are too high, and there are people who people who don't pay enough taxes, right? And that's a very normal thing for one to believe in a society that has taxes, right? Sure, fine. Hey, I feel like interest rates on my bank account should be higher, or I should be making more money, or the bank is screwing me, or whatever. All of those things outside of the realm of associating those professions with individual people are actually quite normal grievances to have in a market-based economy. And in most economies, actually, it doesn't even have to be a market-based economy. Most economies where there are financial services and taxes are going to complain about the unfairness or alleged unfairness of taxes and financial services. So it was then very convenient to link these two people together. So this is floating around in the minds of people when Hitler came to power, right? Now, of course, there were other things that they didn't like about Jews. Jews were often immigrants. For a variety of reasons, Jews were moving around from country to country. This primarily had to do with the fact that we were fleeing people murdering us. But the truth of the matter is, there were lots of Jews were also immigrants. Immigrants have always had a bad rap, but you start to see that if you have a class, Jews spoke a different language. That's another thing that nationalists didn't really love. And especially that language was written in a text that you couldn't read. Yiddish was written in Hebrew. So there were you start to see the accumulation of reasons for why people don't like Jews. And when you start to hate people a lot, you start to do something called dehumanization, which is you essentially use your hatred to justify to yourself that these people are less than human and thus don't deserve the respect of human beings. A long time ago on the show, a bunch of weeks back, I talked about fundamental human rights. And one of those, although I didn't say it then, would be for everyone who is human, which is all of us, to receive those fundamental human rights, right? There's some level of understanding where in order for a human right to be fundamental, it has to be ubiquitous. We all have them. But as people take their hatreds for a particular group and those hatreds amplify for all sorts of reasons, two things can happen. One, you start to humanize them, which is perfectly normal. Two, you start to do another with these people is you start to associate other problems in your life as being related to them, right? And clever politicians, and clever I mean in the bad way here, will realize that there's a tendency to pick up on that. They will start to talk that way. They will link the Jews in this particular things, right? And then as the image of a group of people is made that kind of way to them, right? In the world is their fault, and you already had preconceived hatreds of them for a variety of reasons. So why do I bring this up in terms of Yom HaShoah? I bring it up in terms of Yom HaShoah because it's always important to remember how we got from where we were in Europe in the 1930s to where Europe was in 1945. But it's also important to remember that context in terms of our modern life. What groups of people in the modern world are given these associations with bad things, right? Immigrants are a really good example here because oftentimes the the functioning of whole economies is attributed to groups of immigrants who oftentimes are the least powerful people, right? They oftentimes don't speak the language, and they have all sorts of other issues when they're coming into a country that they've never been to before, right? So they cannot possibly be the reason that things are bad. It just doesn't work that way. They could be part of that process indirectly. So, for example, with the to hire below the going rate of legal loopholes to pad their profits. It's nothing to do with immigrants. The only part of it that has immigrants is their helplessness in the situation, especially if they've crossed into the country. It would be dangerous for them, if not because of their legal status, like that, right? So, in modern times, see so much of the explicit anti-Semitism. You know, we do and we don't. You know, are there still synagogue shootings? Yes. Are there still Jewish grave sites that are defiled? Yes. And those things are tragic. At the same time, we also see rhetoric that puts Jews in particularly uncomfortable positions. Donald Trump was addressing the Republican Jewish caucus and said, you guys like to negotiate better than anyone. And it has to do with the stereotype that Jews are shrewd negotiators, right? We hear conspiracy theorists online talking about how Jews control the world, and at the bottom of many conspiracy theories are Jews. So you look at these old, very, very old tropes and stereotypes about Jews, and you see them coming up in new and innovative ways so that no one ever has to say Jew. Because when you start talking about the globalists, the bankers, the lawyers, the tax collectors, you automatically start to, and especially if you're predisposed to things like this, you may start to get in your head an idea of a person that looks a certain way, that speaks a certain way, and or has a particular religious practice in this case, right? And those are the subtle ways that dehumanization creeps in. As soon as you can identify who that person, who the conspiracy theorist is trying to get you to identify, as soon as you give in to that notion of who the enemy is, that the conspiracy theorist or whoever it is can lead you any way. They have essentially, whatever direction your mind, they can get you to do terrible things to people. And this is the fundamental underpinning of how the Holocaust happened. So to go back to what I said at first, the Holocaust didn't start with gas. Persecution with the most extreme version of that persecution. It will always be the case that there is a long period of time used to build up hatred, to build up hate against the individuals for whom there is going to be significant discrimination. There are some situations in history where this hasn't happened, but for the most part, it is what happened. So, this Yom HaShoah and every Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust started from the Holocaust, even if it was no lessons, can stop the Holocaust. Remember, the Holocaust didn't start.
We're now going to take our dough and push it out in all directions. So I'm using my palm for this. You can use a rolling pin in your if you like. Essentially what we're going to do is we're just going to use our palms to slowly push out the dough in every direction. And then once we are ready, we're going to roll that up as tightly as we can to make it into a log. We're going to put that log in our bread tin, and then we're going to cover it with some plastic wrap and a towel, and then we'll be ready to go. As always, if you have something more sustainable, I highly recommend you use that, but I have plastic, so that is what I'm going to end up using.
All right, so our bread is starting to rise. It is a little cool in my house right now, so I am turning my oven on now to, one, get it preheated, and two, to make sure that we have a little bit more warmth in the house while our bread is rising. It says to leave it for 35 minutes, so I'm going to set a 35-minute timer. In reality, you should keep it rising until the loaf has either filled out the loaf tin, or if you're using a smaller loaf pan, which is what it calls for here, the loaf pan I'm using is a little too big, you need to wait until that loaf starts to peak above the loaf tin. But I'm just looking for it to fill out the loaf pan, okay? So I might go a little longer just kind of based on how it's doing, but we're going to start our politics portion. So set your timers for 35 minutes. I'm going to do some quick cleanup real quick, and then we're going to start our politics portion. So with that in mind, set your timers, make sure that your bread is covered, and I will be right back. All right, we are back and we are going to talk some politics. I have reset my clock to 35 minutes because cleaning took a while, so I figured I'd give you guys the full 35. So we are going to start with some international news. So the French election was this week. Emmanuel Macron was up against Marine Le Pen of the party formerly known as Le Front National, the National Front, but now is Le National Rassemblement, which is the National Assembly. And so the French election system works as follows. Essentially, every candidate for the presidency can run in the first round of elections. Now, if anyone gets over 50% of the vote, they automatically win it and become president. But if not, the top two candidates get to go on to the next round, and then it's essentially, you know how that goes. Two candidates, pick one, whatever. So the reason that the French election was interesting, and the reason I'm bringing it up, is there is some level of nuance underneath the electoral results that we see. So even though there is Alexa, stop. Oh my gosh. Okay. Sorry. My robot was talking to me. So what I'm trying to say is there were some nuances that appear underneath the numbers that you see on top, right? So in the first round, Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron got the two most numbers of votes. However, the amount of votes they got were like 25 and 23%, which wasn't particularly a strong showing by either candidate. And the thing that's interesting about that is Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the kind of French equivalent of Bernie Sanders-ish, came in third with just 22% of the vote. So he was right on the heels. I think it was like 22.1%. But he was right on Le Pen's heels. But if you don't look at that and you just look at who made the final two without looking at the numbers of the remaining candidates, it makes it look like there are only two political camps in France. There are the enlightened centrists, as they were, and the right wing. Now, it's true that the right wing is getting more popular, but if you look at the underlying figures, you can see that the left wing is also getting more popular in France. So what happened in the second round? So in the second round, Emmanuel Macron crushed. He beat Le Pen by double digits. It looked like a crushing victory, which on the surface looks like a mandate for Macron, who is an avowed centrist, okay? However, it's important to note here that Jean-Luc Mélenchon and many other French politicians who ran for the presidency were very careful to say, hey, people who voted for us, I know we didn't win, but whatever you do, don't let Marine Le Pen become president. And because there was this incredible campaign among many of the losing candidates in the first round of the French presidency to quash Le Pen, they were able to actually stop her from winning. Now, many people who voted for Macron actually did not do so because they really wanted to or they liked him, right? They were really just voting against Le Pen, which brings us to an interesting concept that we are all very familiar with here in the United States, which is lesser evilism, right? So the idea, of course, of lesser evilism is that you take a look at two candidates, you think which one of these bastards sucks less, and you vote for the one that sucks less, right? In the US, obviously, you have Democrats and Republicans. It is almost impossible for anyone else. In fact, I think it's actually impossible for anyone else who is not associated with either one of those two parties to make it to the presidency of the United States. So, of course, when you get to the ballot box, you see, okay, I can either vote for the Democrat who I don't like, or I can vote for the Republican I don't like. And people make their decisions that way. And of course, there are people out there, just like there are in every system, who genuinely like the two candidates who are given to them. We're not really talking about them for the purpose of this discussion. Lesser evilism is interesting not just because it is a very obvious people voting against their own direct interests, knowingly so, by the way. This isn't some unknowing version, but lesser evilism actually drives people out of the political process. Now, I'm not sure it would work exactly this way in France, because France actually gives you an opportunity for in the first round for you to potentially have your candidate move forward, right? So there really is more participation. But we saw in the second round of the French presidential election that numbers were actually really, really low. French participation is typically very high, but in this election, the French people voted in percentages that you would only really see in the U.S., which is an incredibly small amount compared to normal. And this, of course, belies the constant fact that people don't like lesser evilism, right? And given the option between two bad candidates, there are some people who are going to take the road of lesser evilism and say, hey, look, I need to vote to prevent the bad guy or gal or whoever from coming to power. But there are many people who are going to say, it doesn't matter to me. Whoever gets elected is going to suck anyway. And thus, they drop out of the process. And so I think the significant decline in percentage of individuals who voted in this particular election actually spells out the worry that we have seen that we've experienced in the United States when it comes to lesser evilism, which is the more people you have drop out of the process, the more likely it is that the right wins. And the reason that is the case is because oftentimes the right wing is much more motivated than the left wing to vote in general, but specifically is more motivated to be insurgent candidates. And Le Pen is a rising star in French politics. She does not seem to go away. She will essentially be around forever. Vote share she has ever gotten. So if lesser evilism continues to play out in France, there's a very real possibility that moderates will start to drop out of the process as well. And of course, the more leftists, the more moderates who drop out of the process makes room to remain in the process because they're very candidate to win. And the thing that was also interesting about the French election that I wanted to bring up that isn't exactly related to lesser evilism is Marine Le Pen had an interesting strategy. So yes, she went with the usual hateful, bigoted stuff. If you're a Muslim, you can't wear a headscarf. Immigrants are bad, yada, 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 racist, yada, 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 right? She went with the usual labels. However, she also threw in a little bit of populism. She talked about unions. She talked about bad wages. She talked about the economy. She talked about taxes, taxing the rich. Now, if she got into power, she would never do those things because, like the right wing in the U.S., the right wing in France is funded by, backed by corporations and rich people, and serves primarily corporations and rich people. So it's never going to be the case that Marine Le Pen is actually going to do those types of things, but she will. There are things that she promised that she will do. So, for example, some of the bigoted stuff. Also, trying to pull France out of the EU, which would be devastating for France's economy, devastating for England's economy. So it is actually genuinely important, not just from kind of a virtue signaling perspective, to keep people like Le Pen out of power. Not because shuffling the system is necessarily bad. Oftentimes systems themselves are very bad and they need shuffling. But people like Marine Le Pen are not the people to do it because they are going to shuffle the system, true, but they're not going to shuffle it in favor of the people. They're going to shuffle it in favor of a small elite. By the way, an elite that continues to get smaller, and corporations, of which continue to get larger, but as competition typically gets smaller, right? Because they're buying up their competitors and things like that. Marine Le Pen is dangerous because she knows what she's doing and she knows how to kind of tease in that language that people will respond to. So really, the lesson that Macron needed to have learned from this election, and we will see if he did or not, is he has to look at the entirety of the French population's ideologies and think, what can I do to get enough people to support the system as it is now, or with little tweaks, right? If he's really going to do the enlightened centrism thing, how can I tweak the system just little enough to get people to back away from the right wing? Because the right wing continues to make promises and the center refuses to deliver, and lefties are not able to get elected. There's a giant lane open for the right wing. And the more right-wing nations there are in Europe who start to dismantle the EU from within, like Viktor Orban, like Boris Johnson and his predecessors, the weaker the European Union becomes. And by the way, whether you like the European Union or not, it's done a large number of good things for Europeans. It also has given the most amount of rights and privileges to actual, regular, everyday Europeans and standardized laws. The European Union has actually been a profound success from an economic perspective. Now, you don't have to love them to acknowledge that, but the truth is, if you create instability, you're not going to help yourselves in the long term. Britain is finding that out. Now, it's entirely possible that Britain bounces back at some point, but they're really struggling right now. Anyway, none of this is relevant to the French election, but it's just important to think about in terms of European politics in general. But it was just kind of interesting that we saw a French election where lesser evilism was certainly a major factor, and it does appear that that dynamic pushed out lots of voters. So there was a fascinating development in Pakistan a week or two back. Imran Khan, who was the prime minister of Pakistan, was removed. There was a vote of no confidence. Now, mind you, at the end of the day, regardless of what you think of Imran Khan, I actually think it was appropriate for him to be removed. The actions he took were clearly a violation of Pakistan's constitution. And even if they weren't, they were clearly a violation of the principles enshrined in a government with separation of powers. So what happened in Pakistan? So essentially, Imran Khan has been losing popularity, and supposedly he also lost the backing of the military, who, by the way, essentially controls all power in Pakistan, even though they are not directly ruling the country any longer. Back to that in a moment. So anyway, he starts to lose his political backers, and the parliament essentially decides, it's your time, bro. It's time to go. By the way, before I go on with the story, it's important to remember that in Pakistan, there's never been, I believe there's never been a prime minister who has actually served out the entirety of their 5-year term. So Pakistan is a very, very young democracy, and it is a very, very unstable democracy. Now, I think this is fine, provided that democracy continues to be the way that they go about doing this. If of course, this instability is used to fuel anti-democratic sentiment, then of course it becomes an issue. But in the meanwhile, I actually think the processes that are going on here, despite their instability, are actually a healthy part of democratic ambitions, right? Instability, but constant commitment to democracy is fine. It's instability without constant commitment to democracy that really presents a problem. So, back to our story. So, the parliament decided it was Imran Khan's time. So they proposed a no confidence motion. Now, mind you, Imran Khan has allies in the parliament. The speaker essentially got rid of the motion and called for and Imran Khan called for new elections. Okay, so this type of collusion, where Imran Khan is directing the speaker of the body that is trying to oust him to scuttle the bill that would oust him, the no confidence vote that would scuttle him, and then dissolving the parliament and calling new elections. Even if it wasn't illegal, it looked really bad. So it turns out it is illegal, and the reason we know that is because the remaining members of parliament sued Imran Khan. They took it to the Pakistani Supreme Court, and luckily the Pakistani Supreme Court was able to resolve this constitutional crisis, and indeed that's what this was, and they ruled in favor of the parliament against Imran Khan. The parliament was brought back into session. It was no longer disbanded. The speaker was removed, the deputy speaker took over, and lo and behold, the now very angry parliamentarians voted almost unanimously to get Imran Khan out of power. And so Imran Khan is out of power. However, what's interesting is that they've replaced him with a essentially dynastic figure whose name escapes me at this very moment. Shoot, why can't I think of his name? Oh my God. I literally just had it. I hate when this happens. Anyway, so the individual who is now Prime Minister of Pakistan is related to the Prime Minister of Pakistan before Imran Khan and is essentially been in a long line of political families. It's essentially a political dynasty, like you have the Clintons and the Bushes in the States, right? But there are two of these types of political dynasties that have essentially traded the prime minister position back and forth between them since democratic rule came about. And, of course, military's involvement. So even though the military of Pakistan has not been ruling Pakistan for a number of years now, it appears that they still play kingmaker. And the Pakistani military has an incredible amount of power in Pakistan politically. Now, I'm not exactly sure why that is still, but it does appear that they have been maintaining their political connections. Now, mind you, this isn't particularly surprising, right? In the United States, the military is an incredibly powerful force, but it doesn't really have the power to kind of bring up and take down political leaders. However, they do control significant portions of the government, yada, yada. So it's important to remember that Pakistan's military will continue to play a large role here. And so it's also speculated, by the way, that the military had some hand in bringing Imran Khan to power. He said things would change, the economy would get better. They didn't. So now he's out of power. Whether you liked Imran Khan or not, I think it's an important thing for us to take away that regardless of who ends up in power in Pakistan for the foreseeable future, one of the things that I personally think they should focus on, other than all the problems that Pakistan is facing, is removing the military's influence from power. And the reason I say that is because when you have the military so close to power, the military will just, it is entirely possible the military just decides one day that it is done with democracy and that it wants to rule once again. We are seeing that happen. We saw an attempt at that in Sudan. We are seeing that happen in Myanmar. So it's not crazy to say that, hey, it's entirely possible, especially because the military was ruling Pakistan before, hey, the military has kind of always been involved in politics. What if they decide that they just don't like democracy any longer and decide to rule again? Who would stop them? And the answer is probably no one. People are still alive who remember military rule in Pakistan, and it's entirely possible that if the military took power tomorrow, there really wouldn't be much by ways of actual institutional strength to stop them from doing so. So part of building a democracy is maintaining civil government and maintaining the transition of power from civil to civil government. So what we're seeing happen, what we saw happen with Imran Khan is actually healthy for a democracy. It's very good that that happened in the way that it did, whether you like Imran Khan or not. But if it's true that the backing of the military was the primary driver between points A and B, then actually the exercise that we saw is not necessarily a good one for democracy, because it demonstrates that the military still has the ability to call the shots, even if they're not doing it directly. And even worse, they can call the shots and make it look like a democratic process is going on. So for me, it seems very much that in Pakistan, you have the illusion of democracy as opposed to actual democracy. So I hope whoever becomes in charge after the next set of elections, which are occurring in the next year or so. No, I'm sorry, they're occurring in August. The next elections are occurring in August. So in Pakistan. So regardless of who wins those elections, I hope that they use their mandate, however big or small it is, to push out the military's influence in in a way that is deft enough to make sure that Pakistan has a thriving democracy. Strong enough to make sure that it has a thriving democracy, but also deft enough so that the military does not kind of see it coming and react by instituting a coup or something. So you may have noticed in the news that the United States is starting to get a little too close for comfort to the Solomon Islands. Now, Ben, why are you talking about this? If the U.S. wants to send people to the Solomon Islands, like diplomatic people, what's it matter? Well, the reason it matters is because the Solomon Islands are now kind of playing out this weird geopolitics that we're starting to see. The United States is losing its is effectively losing its title as lead hegemon, as the only hegemonic or imperial power in the world at this point, and China is on the rise. Now, the thing that is interesting about China's rise is that China is trying to use the Belt and Road Initiative as their primary driver of their colonial expansion. And I've talked about the Belt and Road Initiative a number of times on this show, including just a few weeks ago. But essentially, China is offering a lot of carrots, and they're to people who will kind of sign on to them. And this signing on is not just economic; it also allows for the Chinese to establish military bases, which should sound familiar to Americans because establishing military bases in other countries is like our job here in the U.S. So the Solomon Islands are a little too close to the U.S. for the U.S.'s comfort for China to be building a military base, and the U.S. has sent diplomatic staff there to essentially, I mean, let's be real, beg for the Solomon Islands to not let the Chinese build a military base there. Now, I personally think that this is all a bit silly because the chance that the U.S. and China ever engage in actual warfare is very, very small. Not just because if there was a war, it's entirely possible would end humanity as we know it and both countries, but also because the economies of China and the U.S. are super closely intertwined. And we learned this lesson very hard during the pandemic, where as soon as China started shutting things down, our economy took a nosedive. The economies are extremely close, and so the chance that there is a war between China and the U.S. is actually very small. Now, what's more likely to happen is that you have a number of proxy wars where the U.S. funds one side, China funds the other side. This is not as dangerous as the two powers going to war with each other. However, it does still present a number of dangers, and of course, there are going to be innocent people caught in the crossfire who die needlessly. Obviously, we don't want that. So, it seems to me that the United States is convinced that the latter is either likely or they're concerned the latter will happen. So they've sent diplomatic staff to the Solomon Islands to kind of beg and plead that they don't allow the Chinese to build a military base there. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Truthfully, you know, we probably have actually no, we militarily we militarily support Taiwan, who is very close to China. So I imagine, and by the way, the Solomon Islands actually ain't that close to the US, but it's just kind of closer than China is, right? By a good margin. And it's close enough to Hawaii. So, you know, there's some concern there from the US. I get that. But what I'll say is, even if China put a military base there, they really wouldn't be in any position to harm the United States. And so I think the whole thing's a little bit overblown. But, you know, we in the US have this concept of national security that essentially expands a giant bubble around the US, right? It's not good and well enough for the US, the 50 states, to be secure, but we also like to have lots of proxies and allies around the world, and specifically kind of close proximity to us, kind of our sphere of influence is what we would have called it during the Cold War, where we have nations who essentially will do what we ask them to, or will be our allies should there be a conflict, or they're our ideological ally. So China appears to be stepping into our sphere of influence, very likely trying to expand their sphere of influence. And so we just kind of get to this weird position where the Chinese government is essentially doing in America, and America decides, well, shit, we don't like that. So it turns out it's okay to do in America if you're in America, but not okay to do in America if you're not in America. But jokes aside, I think we will have to wait and see how the U.S. reacts to this. I imagine that the Solomon Islands is taking what the U.S. says seriously, but they already have open communication channels with China, so it's entirely possible they do let the Chinese build a base there. And if they did that, I'm not sure how the U.S. would react. I do not think that we would take military force. Right? We definitely don't want to be engaged in warfare with China for a variety of reasons, some of which I listed off already. But might we do other things? Might we try and topple the government of the Solomon Islands and put someone there who's more U.S. friendly? I don't know. There are a lot of things the U.S. has done when it's thought it's desperate. So, we'll just have to see kind of what the deal is, how the U.S. reacts and how China reacts. And by the way, it's entirely possible that China reacts too, right? We could be looking at a situation where the Chinese government says, hey, the U.S. are kind of really getting, upset about this. Maybe we should back off. Maybe we don't build a military base, maybe we build like a port or something. And by the way, I don't think that the Chinese government cares very much what the U.S. thinks. But remember, we are a long-term strategic and economic partner of China. So it's entirely possible that there's just some posturing that goes on so that the Chinese can kind of maintain the benefits that they get from the relationship with us and vice versa without, having to go through the whole rigmarole of an international incident between the U.S. and China. So I think both sides are just kind of posturing a little bit. I think there's going to be some level where, I don't know if there'll be like a negotiated settlement or whatever, but, the Solomon Islands, very small country, not a ton of defense capabilities, but they are a strategic location. The U.S. calls them a strategic ally. So again, it'll be interesting. So if there's any updates on this story, I will definitely let you guys know. I think it's going to be, I just don't know. I don't know. So we'll see. All right. I have been promising to do this segment for so long. I'm finally going to do it. We're going to talk about state and local financing. Okay. So a couple weeks ago, I did a story on Buffalo, the city of Buffalo. By the way, yes, it's in Erie County. I'm sorry. I didn't know at the time. We know now. We're good. Anyway, the point of me bringing that up is because it was a situation where I talked about how cities don't have a ton of money floating around. And that's true. So let's think about how a city is funded. We'll work on a state later, but let's talk about a city for now. To any city, all done pretty much the same way. So the majority of the revenue, the tax revenue coming into a city comes in April during tax day, right? People file their taxes. Cities get a majority of their tax revenue from that point forward, okay? But the city has to plan a budget for the entire year, right? So what does the city do if it needs more money than it has coming in? Because even though it's a large cash flow, the city doesn't always have a place it can kind of store that money until it needs it, or it uses the influx of money to address insufficiencies that it's having in that moment. Now, before I proceed, it's important to remember that the United States Constitution does not allow for states, equivalent of provinces, for those of you who are not tuning in from the US, or cities to go into debt, okay? So we get into this weird situation where a city cannot actually go to a bank and borrow money and say, hey, we would love to do X, Y, and Z, And in order to do that, we need money. We don't have that money. Can we borrow the money from you? Because this would force the city to go into debt, and it is illegal for cities to go into debt. Personally, I don't think it should be, but I'll get to that later. So what does the city do? Well, one of the things that cities can do, and if you live in a city, you know that cities do this, they can start imposing fines and fees, and they can create ordinances which essentially are easy to break and there are little fines for. So, for example, I live in the city of Philadelphia. If you are parked illegally, you get and it's not having to do with a fire hydrant or an intersection with a specific label on it. The fine is $26. Okay. Oh, where a bus is. So the fine is $26. So every time you park illegally, you have to pay $26. Now, in a city of millions of people, like Philadelphia is, there are lots of people who probably bake this oh my God, on a regular basis. And the city uses those fees to pay for the agency who actually is ticking the meters and check and giving out the fines. By the way, if you violate a meter, also $26 fine. But either way, so they use that money to pay for the agency, but then they use any money that's left on top of it to help fund the city. Okay, so that's just parking, but you know that there are a variety of situations where it's illegal to do this, that, and the other thing without a license, permit, whatever. And all those licenses and permits and zoning certificates and yada 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 yada. That's all revenue, right? The city brings that in, but it's not really enough. And the city then has to kind of find interesting ways to get more money so that it has it year round. So cities have devised something very interesting, but also very dangerous. By the way, this essentially works the same way at the state level, but there are different considerations, which is why I'm going to talk about that one separately. So at the city level, they create bonds, and they sell these bonds to banks. The banks buy the bonds for a certain amount of money. Now, if you don't know how a bond works, essentially, when you buy a bond, you give money to someone and you say, hey, you can have this money, but in X number of years or in X number of months or in X number of time periods, you need to give me that money back, or you need to sell that bond back to me. But because I'm letting you borrow this money, because I need an incentive to sell this to you, to buy this from you, to buy the bond from you, you need to give me interest on that money, right? So if I'm a bank, say Philadelphia has $100 million worth of bonds. So as a bank, I say, I'm willing to buy your $100 million worth of bonds, which, by the way, gives the bank the bonds and gives the city the cash, right? But I'm not going to buy this bond unless you give me a 1% interest rate. So in April, we'll pretend it's like July or something. In April, when you get all your tax revenue, I want the $100 million back plus my 1% interest on that, so $101 million. Okay, and the city says sure, because the city knows roughly from projections. Now I'm just making up these numbers, of course, but the city roughly knows from projections on taxable income about how much money it's going to have each April when it gets a massive dump of money. Okay, from the taxpayers. So the city then agrees to sell the bonds to these interested stakeholders, and they negotiate for what those interest rates should be. Now, oftentimes a city will have just predetermined what the interest rate will be. It doesn't really matter. There's an interest rate on top of it. That money is not flowing freely, okay? But because of the way that bonds can be sold, the city can essentially sell bonds anytime it needs money. However, the promise, of course, is when tax day comes and the city gets all this money, they then have to pay back all their creditors. But they're not technically creditors because the city isn't borrowing money. It's not going into debt. But you can see how it's effectively the same thing, right? There is money exchanged, there's a repayment period, and there's interest involved. It is effectively a loan. But because it legally is not a loan, cities can do it, okay? Now, the thing that's very interesting about this is that this is a situation that works really great for cities for the most part. However, if for some reason the amount of tax revenue coming in does not equal the amount owed by the bondholders, well, guess what? The city cannot borrow money. because it is illegal for it to borrow money. So it has to cut places. And we all know that when a city cuts places, it typically cuts from those who need it most. So the thing about this that's so problematic is that this can become a vicious cycle. You have one bad year, and the city is suddenly in a terrible position. And by the way, the banks know this, where the city has to continue to sell bonds for higher and higher interest rates. And of course, it then gets into more and more debt, but it's not really debt, right? So you get into this weird situation where cities have to be bailed out, even though technically they were never in debt in the first place. Same thing happens with states. So what is the solution here, right? Well, the first and what hopefully should be the most obvious solution is, well, we should just make sure that cities and states can borrow money. Perfect. Love it. Who are they going to borrow from? Banks. So there are a couple options here. One is they can be allowed to borrow banks, but the federal government could put a cap on how much interest the banks can charge. Or there is the bank that the states borrow from could be the Fed Bank, could be the US Treasury, and they could pay interest back to the United States government, with the United States government having the option to say, hey, actually, we're going to cancel your debt at any time, right? The Congress could write a law that says states and cities can borrow money. They can only borrow it from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will lend it to them at a rate no higher than blank, and at the at the pleasure of the Fed chair, the states and the city's debt can be wiped clean if it's found in the the financial interest of the United States government to do that, right? They could do that. Or the other thing that they could do is essentially you could borrow that money from the government for free. So the United States government produces money, right? That's one of the main jobs that it does. It produces money when it needs it. Now, of course, I've talked about modern monetary theory on the show multiple times, but essentially this is where modern monetary theory could shine. Essentially, a city could say to the federal government, or a state could say to the federal government, we have a budget shortfall of X amount. We want to do Y. Can we have X amount of money? The government could literally just print the money and give it to the state or city to use. And that way, they never have to borrow the money. And there's never any obligation for a payback to occur because the money is essentially free to them. Now, of course, you might be worried that, oh my gosh, if we give all this money to cities and states, they're going to do all sorts of crazy things and there'll be no accountability and they'll just spend and the government will just give them. Well, fair enough. You could put limits on what level or what types of things the government could give that money for. Now, by the way, before you think this is a good idea, it's actually quite dangerous because essentially you will make this into a partisan game, okay? And especially because the decision about this would be made at the executive level. You essentially have any president who could essentially decide on a whim what they do and don't like states spending money on, which truthfully is the worst idea. We don't want this. But you can also say that states can only get a maximum of X amount of dollars, right? You could limit the ways in which states could acquire this money. That way, making sure that no matter what, even though the money is interest-free and the money is essentially free to the state, you don't have to worry about a situation where it's out of control because eventually the government just says, we're no longer interested in funding you past a certain amount. And, there are plenty of ways to do it. And I'm sure people much smarter than me have figured ways to do it. But you first have to get over this hurdle. The reason I've been meaning to talk about this for so long is because cities and states are effectively doing the thing they're barred from doing in the first place. And this conversation is a really nuanced one, and there's lots of information here, that people don't really know about how cities and states manage their finances. But if we change the posture of the government such that we allow for cities and states to do the thing they're essentially already doing, but we make that thing safer for them, we are likely going to improve all of our interactions with local government. And I include states and local government here. So I hope this has been informative. I hope you learned something about how cities and states manage their finances. I hope you have thought about the solution. And by the way, if you're active in your local governing body or whatever, ask them about this, right? Ask them how much money they get in bonds versus how much comes in through taxes. And then spread the word. Think about ways that we can stop this predatory behavior from banks to cities and states, who are essentially forced to take this really convoluted route to do the same thing that they're prohibited from doing. How are we looking over here? Oh, no. Oh, wow, it's looking great. All right, so we have our bread here. I'm just going to do the big reveal. Wow! Actually, it looks really good. It looks really good. I was actually a little worried that the bread was going to be a little dry. We have a really lovely bread here. So what I'm going to do, my oven is preheated. I am going to give this a little score. Thanks, Uncle George, for the knife. I'm just going to run my blade along here 3 times. Give it that nice look there. There you go. And now we're going to put this in the oven for 35 minutes. Okay, when you have it in the oven, you want to make sure that you leave it in there. Okay, sorry, 30 minutes. There you go. For 30 minutes. Once it's in there, you want to make sure that you're watching it, because if it browns too much, it can burn, because we're a little higher than you typically bake a bread, and it has nothing on it to protect it. Okay, we don't have anything else. If you want a harder crust, you can paint some water over this. If you want a softer crust, you can paint some milk. If you want a golden crust, you can paint some egg. Whatever you want, do it that way. I'm going to put mine in plain because that's what the recipe specifies. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. I will see you guys next time. Bye now.
Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.